Welcome to this edition of The Patrick Coffin Show. Today we're going to talk about something that is enormously popular in the Catholic Church and has earned some attention outside the Church, and that is all of the events that happened on a hillside in then Yugoslavia, starting from Wednesday, June 24th, 1981, when some young people said that they saw the Blessed Virgin Mary, in Croatian, the Gospa, or Our Lady. From that first week, back in 1981, we have seen 40,000 or so separate alleged apparitions from what the teens, now adults, have said is the Blessed Virgin Mary, giving messages to humanity and secrets and all manner of content. Today we're going to talk about the truth about Medjugorje. And here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to attack or mock the simple faith of people who've encountered Christ there, who've come back to the church, who've even found their religious vocations. All we're going to do is something very discreet and very simple, and that is talk about the historical context of the relationship between the Franciscan order and the local Catholic bishops there in the diocese of Mostarduvno, which is the governing diocese of the hamlet, Medjugorje. And we're going to review some of the official documents of the Church and provide some sense of framing in context of all of this marathon of decades of messages. We'll talk about the content of the messages and just provide you with information I'm fairly certain you've never heard before, or if you have, you've heard a half-true version of them. So today, the truth about Medjugorje. My name's Patrick Coffin. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. We'll do it in two parts with our guest, historian Donal Foley. Don't miss it. Coming up straight ahead. Yes, indeed, we are back, launching on Medjugorje with Donal Foley, historian and religion writer, as well as the author of The Secret of Gaston Tor, a children's book series. He's also the secretary for the World Apostolate of Fatima in England and Wales, and the author of Medjugorje Revisited, 30 Years of Visions or Religious Fraud. Now, full disclosure, I wrote the preface to this book. I want to show it up there. You can get it at patrickcoffin.media, and I'm going to put some show notes. We're also going to be talking about another book by a Franciscan who was born and raised in Medjugorje, Father Ivo Sivrich. Donal Foley, it's an honor to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yes, I'm happy to be here.
And I was happy that you asked me to write the book because I'd never encountered such a charitable, fact-based, meticulously researched account going back to World War II and the Serb Croatian backdrop of warfare and nationalism and so on. So thanks for writing the book and then taking the time to write another version, an updated version. So thanks for your work on that.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, I felt it needed a full overview of the whole thing so that people can have a better understanding. So that was what I was thinking of.
There's not much in it to talk about this for you and me. I've done some Google searches online, and the people who run the movement, who have a vested, including a financial vested interest in it, really do not like you. They don't like me very much either. And I'm called I'm anti-Medjugorje, or I'm a fierce opponent. This is something that can lose. You can lose speaking engagements over. You can make people very, very angry by simply saying you stand with the church and the teaching and the position from the beginning of unapproval. This is an unapproved apparition. So maybe the first premise we can start with is, if even Lourdes and Fatima or any approved apparition is not strictly binding on the faithful, an unapproved apparition is certainly not binding. So let me ask, this is a long-winded way of asking you, when you first got interested in Medjugorje as a phenomenon, how you heard about it, and whether or not you've been there.
Yes, well, I went there in 1988, having previously gone to Fatima in sort of about 3 or 4 years before that. Mm-hmm. And I was actually out of the church in the sort of until the early 80s. And going to Fatima was a sort of life-changing experience for me, really. I took part in a walking pilgrimage, and it was just such a wonderful experience. That's what really got me into Fatima. Mm-hmm. Then, in 1988, I went to Medjugorje because I, like most people, I suppose, at the time I'd heard about it. But I didn't really know enough about apparitions to really have a good judgment about the whole thing at the time. And I went there and I just felt something wasn't quite right. I just sort of couldn't put my finger on it. But then sometime after that, then I wrote the big book about Marian apparitions and going through the approved ones. And when I was doing that, I gradually came to understand how there was a sort of pattern to the apparitions, the approved ones.
The
like,
approved ones,
Fatima, Fatima Lourdes and Guadalupe and so on. And then after I'd done that, then I was looking more at the sort of unapproved ones. And then I realized Medjugorje was the sort of biggie, which I needed to sort of properly look at. But I went into it thinking, I just want to know what the truth about this is. Is it true or not? And that's how the whole thing of the book came about, just from that. I wanted to just see for myself, examine it and see what the reality was.
I'm also going to put a link to your book on Marian apparitions. It's an excellent overview of the criteria the Church uses to determine and discern, the truth behind it, independent of any emotional or subjective convictions that people have. Because I've noticed this about you and I spoke off the air about the three kinds of people who are listening and watching right now. I don't know what the proportions are, but on the one hand, there's a small percentage of deeply devoted, we have to say fanatically attached to this phenomenon, and nothing you say or I say is going to change anything. Will not put a dent in their resolve and their enthusiasm. So I'm not doing this show for them. Their minds are already made up. I don't want to disturb them with the facts. On the other hand, there are people who are sarcastic, and they also are ignorant of the truth of it, and they have a set of misunderstandings as well. So hopefully we can serve their needs and be of value as far as just uncovering some of the historical facts and the truth of the local ordinary judgment from the first bishop there, the late His Excellency Pavo Janic, and the current bishop Ratko Peric. It's really the middle group, which I suspect is the largest proportion of people maybe on the fence, maybe have heard this and that, maybe some friends have gone there and either had a good experience or a skeptical one. That's really the reason why I'm doing this show at all, because the blowback is so nasty from the first group, from the zealots. It's very it's sad to see people who it's almost a substitute Catholicism, that they identify adherence to the Catholic faith with adherence to this unapproved apparition. I wanted to ask you about maybe some of the history. Well, before I get to the history, because I want to talk about the historical tension between the Franciscans and the local diocesan bishops. So let me start with approved apparitions. There are certain qualities that approved apparitions share. Now, I think from the book, I remember, Donald, you took the time to type out all of the content of Our Lady's messages from Our Lady of Guadalupe to Fatima. And if memory serves, all of them combined will fit on 11 pages. Am I remembering correctly?
That sort of figure, yes. Yeah.
And that goes to the quality of pithiness, right? Not a word wasted, very almost blunt spoken messages about something prophetic and almost immediately attached to miracles and changed lives and kind of a revivified local Catholic faith expression. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I would say it is, Patrick, yes. I mean, the general thing with the approved apparitions is that you've got, normally it's quite a young person, either, in terms of age, years, and quite often children who are, below the age of puberty, such as Fatima children. Or it's a sort of childlike person like St. Catherine Labouré at Rue de Bac, or Juan Diego at Guadalupe, or the people at Knock, who are just simple country people. Yeah. We're not talking about sophisticates. And the other thing, generally, these apparitions are over a short period of time. They're not generally going on for years and years. We're talking, Fatima, you're talking about 6 main apparitions. Lourdes, it's less than 20. Knock and La Salette, it was just one apparition of a couple of hours each time, and yet that was enough for two fairly, fair-sized apparition sites to spring up. Yeah. There's still a lot of people go to Knock now. I was there recently.
I've been to Knock. There were a lot of people there, And Knock it strikes me as almost the anti-Medjugorje, in the sense that there's no message. There's no verbal content whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's a depiction, really. It's almost like a snapshot of heaven. The altar, St. John, the Blessed Mother, a lamb. It's like a Revelation chapter 12, but without any speaking.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the lamb is sort of, like the sacrifice, the mass. Saint Joseph was there.
Yeah.
It was, as you say, a totally silent apparition. But I forget the number now. It's something like 750,000 people a year go to Knock. So, and it's only a tiny little place. There's not much to do.
And it's not near the airport either.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, those are the characteristics anyway. The approved apparitions, going right back to Guadalupe, Rue de Bac, La Salette, Lourdes, Bano and Boreng, Fatima. All the big important apparitions have got that sort of quality of not many apparitions, youngish people, and as you say, a very pithy, condensed sort of message. So that's the picture, really.
Let's press the rewind button and go back to the massacres during World War II and following on the other side of Podbrdo Hill there, outside Medjugorje, and how the area is known as a place of folklore that I'd have to say is marinated in occultic images and memories and kind of blood vengeance between Serbs and Croats.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the historical backdrop in the decades leading up to the claims of 1981.
91. Well, I suppose in a sense you've almost got to go back centuries really to try and put the whole thing in context, because that area was conquered by the Muslims, and so that was where the Franciscan connection comes in, because they were the only ones priests allowed to stay there. So this very close bond grew up between the people and the Franciscans. Then in the 19th century, when the Habsburg Empire sort of pushed the Muslims back, then they wanted to have a proper hierarchy, but the Franciscans resisted. And this resistance has gone on almost up to now, not wanting to give the parishes back. But at the same time, then you've got a whole, the whole Yugoslavia thing, the Serbs, the Croats, the sort of divisions. But just a point to make is, going back 500 years, there was a sort of it was a very primitive sort of religion, and they were worshipping a thunder god. This is with Križevac and it was, that whole business. So, and then there was sort of ancestor worship mixed in with it. And one of the fallout, if you like, from the Muslim occupation was that their vendettas started to grow up, because people were, family members were being attacked by the Muslims, and they would betray people. And there was this whole sort of thing of vendettas and clan warfare almost.
Yeah. So
there's a very, very messy background to the whole thing, which most people are just pilgrims, are just totally unaware of. So they're coming. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Well, how did this culminate in 1975 or so with Paul VI? And
right.
This is a very important directive that was ignored and mocked and derided. What was that conflict over?
That was essentially over this business of the parishes going back to a normal hierarchy, so that the country could have a normal church life, rather than having the Franciscans running, half the parishes or even more. And they were resisting, and Pope Paul VI issued a decree, Romanus Pontificibus, and this ordered the Franciscans to comply with what was required of them. And it wasn't until the late 90s that they started to sort of come into the thing. But I mean, it means you've got an entire province who is sort of in active disobedience towards a demand of the Pope. So that's serious. That's a serious thing. But to come back to your earlier point, about the massacre, that was at the time in the Second World War, when the Ustaša were in charge, and there's a Croat sort of militia or the government, and there was a terrible massacre of Serbs, actually, as you said, just not a stone's throw away from Medjugorje. And that, and perhaps we will discuss later on, about the sort of possible diabolical element, but I think that that's an element there which it needs to be taken into consideration, definitely.
I went for 10 or 12 years never hearing a peep from a critical voice or even someone raising an eyebrow about this. I was living in Canada, and I actually went to a Marian conference in Hamilton, Ontario, where Ivan Dragisevich, one of the 6 seers, was there, and he had his little experience, and that's when I dropped it. Now, I know this is a subjective experience and it's worthless. My opinion has no value here whatsoever, but it was creepy to me. It bothered me that I had to pay $15 to watch this.
Yeah.
There's another note of discontinuity with approved apparitions.
Yeah.
And second, the message when it was translated into English was, with all due respect, insipid, kind of dull. There's no meat in it, just sort of a Catholic version of Hallmark. And that's when a kind of light bulb went off. Wait a second. And I began to read other voices, people who have also changed their mind, like Father Filipovich, who was Franciscan, who was a tour leader and a big advocate, until he began to see some things that did not fit at all. And Father Povich ended up concluding that Medjugorje is the devil's work for the pious. Which is a very interesting way to put it.
Pretty accurate, I think.
Well, I want to get into the first week, but before I do, I wanted to ask you about the first bishop, Pavel Janich, was initially also supportive. He was a very Marian bishop. I understand he led 11 pilgrimages of his pilgrimage flock to Fatima 11 times. But when he interviewed them and he heard the tapes that Father Zozo and Father Cuvallo taped these interviews, the first week, he too had no doubt in his mind that this is not the Blessed Virgin Mary appearing. This is either something diabolical or it's humanly fraudulent. What is the official teaching of the Church? What is the Latin designation, non constat de supernaturalitate? What does that mean? Is that a full condemnation? Is it hesitant approval? What does it mean?
Well, it literally means the supernatural character is not established, which means it's a sort of in-between judgment between constat de supernaturalitate, which means the supernatural character is established, and constat de non-supernaturalitate, which means the non-supernatural character is established. So it's a sort of in-between judgment, which is saying, we're not sure, that there's nothing. We're not saying it's definitely not supernatural, but we're not really sure, and that's the sort of judgment that was given with the Zadar Declaration. But
that was just for people who don't know, ZA or Z in Canada and England, ZADAR, the Zadar Declaration. When was that, and what did it determine? That was the first official broad-based psychological backdrop, and so on, right? What did it conclude?
Well, that was the Bishops' Conference of the country at the time. That was 1991. And that, up to that point, it had been, first of all, dealt with by Bishop Zanich and with his own little commission. And then another commission. And then, obviously, because the thing was spreading, it went up to the sort of next level, the whole bishops. And they talked about, the need for pastoral provision for the pilgrims, but they made that judgment, of the supernatural character cannot be established. But the point I make in the book is that if, say, it was something like Fatima, and they said after 6 apparitions, supposing there be, or some other apparitions, there was a judgment that says the supernatural character cannot be established, would you say, fine, it's in the early days, we don't know how it's going to develop, and so on. But this judgment was made, 10 years after the beginning of it, after thousands and thousands of alleged apparitions, and they're saying basically they couldn't establish that any of them were supernatural. So then are you saying, well, they want to wait another 10 years and then maybe some will start to become supernatural? Yeah, it's really a negative judgment in the context of what would happen to Medjugorje. It isn't effectively a negative judgment. Yeah, it's a no. My analogy is if I get down on one knee and I propose to a beautiful woman, and she says, "I'll get back to you," that's no. Only yes is yes, right? Yeah. And for his troubles, let me talk a little bit about the second bishop. After Bishop Janich passed away, he was replaced by another, in a way, more committed
to skepticism about Medjugorje,
Yeah.
placed there by John Paul II, who's often sold as a private, huge supporter of Medjugorje, which he may have been. He'd made no public statements about it at all. John Paul II went to Bosnia-Herzegovina twice in his papacy, and went 20 minutes away to an approved Marian shrine, never went to Medjugorje, never said anything publicly. And so he puts in Bishop Peric, who's still there. He's still the official ordinary. And he had a nasty run-in with people who physically kidnapped him and took off his pectoral cross, and I understand an armed contingent from the UN had to rescue him. Remember that anecdote?
That's a true story. And even Father Laurenton, who's very pro-Medjugorje, had to acknowledge that actually happened. I mean, they literally ripped off the pectoral cross, held him, beat him up, kept him, as a prisoner, and it took the UN troops to release him. But actually striking a bishop, as far as I understand, that is an excommunicate. You can be excommunicated just for that. So it's a very serious incident, that throws a whole light on the whole background of the thing again, which most pilgrims have got no idea of what's going on. There's a sort of fanaticism there, which obviously there was a war there, so the people's passions are sort of running high, and it's not good.
In Fatima, Our Lady talked about world peace and the need for prayer and reparation, the tradition of First Saturdays and making reparations to all the crimes against God and God's being offended, and it's all kind of wrapped prophetically with historical events that did come to pass, chiefly the dawn of the Second World War. I've heard it said that Medjugorje is similarly miraculous because it stopped the war, or bombs were dropped everywhere, but nowhere near St. James Church and so on. Didn't the war intensify after 1981? There seems to be no connection between the appearance of what they're calling the Queen of Peace and actual peace there.
Exactly, yes. I mean, you can't, just to mention Fatima first quickly. Fatima, Portugal at the time was, they'd had coups, it was a revolution, the king had been executed or assassinated, and the country was at the time of Fatima, was in an absolutely awful state, with churches being persecuted. And then 25 years after Fatima, in 1942, the Cardinal of Lisbon, at the sort of celebration, said if somebody had fallen asleep in 1917 and woke up today, they would not believe the transformation of the country. The country went from being a total mess to being a peaceful religious country, and he said you could hardly find any non-believers. So there'd been a complete transformation. Now you contrast that with Medjugorje, where 10 years after the alleged visions, the worst fighting since World War II broke out in Europe. You had all the ethnic cleansing, the murders, the rapes, the torture, a complete disaster zone. And this is supposed to be the Queen of Peace. So it's it's there. It's a fact. Historical contrast is so vivid that it can't be denied.
What are some more similarities that are shared among unapproved apparitions? I could mention Neseda in Wisconsin, Bayside, New York, the Holy Love Shrine in and around Cleveland or Cincinnati, I think it's Cleveland, all of which were unambiguously condemned by the local bishops. They still have websites. Pilgrims still go there. They still say there are good fruits like conversion and confession and so on. I mean, Bayside with Mrs. Veronica Lucan is, in all charity, totally loopy. There's just no way a sound-minded person could say this is coming from the Mother of God. I'm very interested in the description that the seers give of the appearance of the Gospa in these experiences, dating from the first month, the first week, in fact. This comes very clearly in the transcripts of the interviews that their spiritual directors gave at the time with the teens. Not only can they not get their story straight, the appearance that they describe is frankly bizarre, that Our Lady, you touch her garment and it's like steel. I think Yakov Kolo, the youngest, touched her garment or her veil, and it began to be dark and charcoaly, and that sort of spread, and that was kind of disturbing. And the Gospa explained that was his sinfulness affecting her Immaculate Conception. Well, this is This is not
Doesn't make
believable.
sense.
It doesn't. You can't. It doesn't cohere with the dignity and the majesty of all the other approved apparitions. What are some of the other examples, like her manner of appearing and so on, and going up in the sky and lights everywhere?
Yeah, it's the way the sort of Gospa appeared to them, it was this idea of as if it was the visionaries on the tapes are talking about a mistiness. She's coming out of the mist. It's a sort of gradual thing. Now, if you contrast that with the genuine apparitions, with sort of Fatima Lords and so on, there you get this very clear thing that the vision they see is there sort of instantly. They look, and the Fatima children, they were playing, they turned around and Our Lady was there on the home oak tree. Same with St. Bernadette. And there's this quality of, it's immediacy, it's there. Whereas with Medjugorje, it's a sort of gradual, slowly developing thing. And what I compare it to within the book, it's like this idea of, somebody looks into a crystal ball and they see a cloud and gradually the thing clears and they see whatever they see. Something evil, obviously.
Yeah.
So that's one of the, problems with it. The other problem, the more general problem, is often with these things, you're talking about these alleged visions going on for years and years and years. So, Garabandal was about 4 years, Medjugorje, now we're into year 36, or 37, 36. And there's that, this sort of length. Nasido, I think, was a similar quality. You've got other various things like, the rosaries changing colour and so on. Yeah. But those are the sort of things, and as you said, the business with, touching Vitska touching Our Lady, her fingers bounced off as if she was made of steel. And then the vision they saw, the Gospa, was holding a baby and then hiding the baby from them. And then just the thing she said as well, there was no message really during the first week. So there's so much, which is actually, Father Zovko said the same thing.
Yeah, so what's the message? We don't know. In fact, I think they said the Gospa doesn't seem to know.
No, that's right. Well, Father Zovko was sort of saying, well, what sort of Gospa is this? She's like a child. She doesn't know anything. So he was frustrated because he was, at the time, obviously, you get thousands and thousands of people coming there. The authorities were on his back to sort of do something about it, to move the whole thing into church so it could be controlled. And that's the reason why it moved into the church.
Because of the threat of the communist persecution? They just wanted this shut down or controlled or corralled in some way?
They were putting pressure on Father Zovko to move the whole thing into the church so that it could be controlled. That was the communists were terrified that the thing would get out of control, and eventually what did happen, that the Croatian nationalism was sort of inflamed, and then the whole thing, the country started to fall to bits. So their fears were sort of well founded, but
so the apparitions, which were preset, pre-announced, as it were, 6:40 p.m. Everyone knew beforehand this is going to happen, and such. And apparently, wherever the seers are, the Gospa allegedly appears to them. I remember watching video footage about the time that I had seen the Medjugorje seer in Hamilton, and it was filmed by our mutual friend Louis Belanger, a Canadian professor, and he filmed them in their ecstasy, and he was fascinated by the claim of Vitska that whenever they're in their apparition mode, if you will, they see nothing, absolutely nothing, they hear nothing except the Gospa speaking to them. There's no awareness of anything else in their field of vision. So he had an assistant do this, with the old Three Stooges gesture of the two fingers to kind of go to poke Vitska, and she did what I would do. She moves her head.
Yeah.
And then the apparition's over and the prayers are finished, and a few minutes later, Vitska comes up with a priest who's now actually out of the priesthood, who was one of their leaders at the time, explaining with subtitles, you can look it up on Vimeo, that she doesn't remember anybody's fingers, she doesn't remember that, but she did say that during that apparition, the Blessed Mother appeared to be dropping the baby Jesus, and she felt that she needed to help her, have baby Jesus not hit the ground. That is the official account of her explanation of her jerking her head back. I mean, this is
it's
another example of things that most people have never heard before.
Exactly. I mean, that's something people should take the time to look at because it's so obvious.
Yeah,
But
I'll link it on my site.
Yeah. The thing about it is that if she just said nothing, then it would have probably been passed by because, people would say, well, she was in a sort of trance and she moved back. But then to come up with that explanation about Our Lady dropping the baby Jesus, really it demonstrates that there was a orchestrated response. We've got to find some explanation for that. But it's just a typical, a good example of how the whole thing is not supernatural.
Donald, we could go for 9 or so hours just on the heretical content and kind of the insipid nature of so many of these thousands and thousands of messages. Can I bring up one example? Because I think it's a prominent one that's it's disturbing to read, but since it happened at first as an anecdote, but then in Vitska's diary, she's the main leader, by the way. I don't know how to pronounce her surname. She, at the time, was sort of the de facto spokesperson for the seers. Now, this is from her diary, which is published, and she's relating events on Friday, September 4th, 1981. This is the 72nd apparition. So this is, 77 apparitions is a lot, or 72, that's a lot. But we're talking over against 40,000 plus, so this is really at the beginning.
Yeah.
I'm normally allergic to reading on the air, but I think it's worth it here. She says, today we waited for the Gospa at Maria's, another one of the seers. I, Marija, Ivanka, and Yakov. At 6:20, we began to pray. The Gospa came immediately, she says. We asked about the Franciscans, the sisters of the parish, and those who are coming here, and the Gospa said that they should come in greater numbers, that they should pray more and also thank God. We asked about the story of a man who had seen Jesus on his way when he was taking some people to their destination. He, the driver, met a man all bloodied. That man was Jesus. Jesus gave him a bloodied handkerchief and asked him to throw it into a river. Driving further on, he met a woman, and that woman, dressed all in black, was the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she asked the driver to hand the bloodied hanky over to her. The driver offered her his own hanky, but the Gospa, allegedly the Blessed Virgin, wanted the bloody one. When the driver gave her the bloody hanky, the Gospa said, "If you had not given it to me, that would have been the end of the world." The Gospa said that was the truth. September 5th, I'll just do one more here. We waited for the Gospa at Maria's. As soon as we started to pray at 6:30, she greeted us with praise be Jesus. We mentioned the sick, and the Gospa began to talk, and we listened to her. She mentioned what would happen if the people would not turn away from sin. Now, this is a quote from the Gospa, allegedly. The other day, you were within a hairbreadth of destruction. In a minute, I have saved you from destruction. She spoke about the sign. If it continues this way, we will never see the sign. So here's a kind of, first of all, frankly, bizarre anecdote about a man covered in blood and a woman dressed in black and a bloody hanky, and if you didn't throw the hanky in a river, the world would end. Really? I think a lot of people see that as a major deal breaker, since it was doubled down in print as being accurate. When you discovered this anecdote, what was your reaction?
It's just the same, Patrick. It's just a sign of Vitska's sort of very fertile imagination. But I think also it's a reflection of sort of the folk tales and stories that were in circulation she probably heard as a child. I think it's an expansion of that, which she somehow managed to introduce into the diary. Unless there was some sort of diabolical involvement, which actually gave her that message, which is certainly possible. But that's the other thing about the whole background. With it's very much, you've got this sort of like a mixture of Catholicism and these sort of primitive ideas. They're in Medjugorje. They had this idea of there was a sort of middle ground. And the idea that the devil was sort of on one side and Our Lady was on the other side, and it was sometimes as if the gospel wasn't powerful enough. They've got a sort of it's not a fully Catholic mentality, really. So those are the sort of stories.
Let me just toss out one more, and that is the time, I believe, in the late 80s. I could be off on I'm terrible at remembering when ago something happened, but the Gospa vision first appeared as a demon, as a sort of a demonic, very disturbing image. And then the, quote, real Gospa appeared and said, essentially, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
That was still one of the visionaries. I think it was quite early on. I mean, the problem about that is that this, in the genuine apparitions, you don't get the devil or anybody else sort of, sharing the stage, as it were, with Our Lady. It's just Our Lady. And then it's when after the event, then you might get false apparitions or whatever. That happened at Lourdes, that there were false apparitions and there was strange lights seen at Knock afterwards. So this idea of mixing in Our Lady and the devil in the one thing strongly suggests that the whole thing was diabolical. Because, as St. Paul said, the devil can appear as an angel of light. So
correct, right.
He could do things like that. He's not... he's extremely powerful. We underestimate him very at our cost.
Well, supporters will say, look, there was an apparition that Sister Lucia had that was not approved. Melanie at La Salette had some that were not approved. And this is just one more example of, some are hits and some are misses. How do you respond to that?
Well, with Melanie, what she did, they had one apparition, which lasted a couple of hours, or probably less than a couple of hours. What she did then later on, she went a bit off the rails, and she became a sister, and then elaborated. See, they were given secrets, that's definitely true, at La Salette. And then she elaborated on her secret in a way that was not justified. And she's embroidered the whole thing. Yeah. Whereas it's probable that a book was written about 10, 15 years ago by somebody who it looks as though they found the La Salette secrets in the Vatican archives, and they're very short. They're not. There's not a big thing as Melanie put out.
Sure.
So that was an after the event. Now I'm not sure about the first thing. I'm not sure what you mean about Sister Lucia. But
were there post 1917 apparitions that she had that were not accounted among the ones through the summer and the fall of 1917?
Well, they were, yes, they were more sort of private.
Right, so only binding on her, not part of the official declaration of Fatima per se.
Yeah, well, they're in the memoirs, the sort of things that she experienced. I mean, yeah, it's a very good point, actually. I mean, it touches on things like the 5 First Saturdays, but I mean, basically they're elaborations of what was in the original message. So they're not, things she just came up with. Because in July 1917, Our Lady said, I will come back to speak about, the 5 First, the communion reparation, which is the 5 First Saturdays, and the consecration of Russia. So they were things so they were already present in the message. Yeah. It wasn't a question of, it's new. Just coming up with new stuff. So, I think that's, yeah.
I'll give you another kind of idea virus that spreads around. Okay. It's probably all over the world now, and that is the narrative that says the local bishops were acting in bad faith, or in the case of Bishop Janic, he was a coward and he was sort of a communist dupe who was kind of pushed around and sort of a spineless fellow.
Yeah.
And that eventually the negative assessments of the local bishops meant that the Vatican, quote, stripped them, I've read this many times, stripped them of their authority, and it was taken from their hands because they were obviously tainted and biased. You've heard this?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so what's the truth? What's the answer?
Well, I think the sort of essential aspect of it is that when the Medjugorje started to grow in importance and became sort of more widely known, it started off with the local bishops looking at it. Then it went up to the bishops' conference within Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then it went up to the level, and then further and further up into the level of the commission, which we've got now. And that process is actually laid out in a document that was issued in 1978, Norma Congregatianis, and that gives this progression, that if the thing goes on a much higher level, then the local bishop is too, in a sense, too much for the local diocese to deal with, and it goes up to the next level, and so on.
Well, if I can just interrupt, if the local people said, okay, non constata supernaturalitate, the bishop has spoken, the supernatural character is not established, okay, we quit. That would have short-circuited everything else that's happened since, right? If they had been obedient, there would be no need to take it to the next level of authority.
Well, I suppose you've also got to sort of factor in the pastoral aspect of it. That a lot of people going there, and the numbers are growing all the time. And of course, you had the reports of conversions and so on. So. And then in the early days, they had the prayer and the fasting, which incidentally don't come from the messages of the Gospa, but actually they were there in the culture already. So it was in these early days that there was discernment was needed, because it could possibly be ingenuine. So you've got to give the thing time to play out, and you can't just go in too quickly and just say no. Because obviously it's a serious matter. But I mean, with the bishops, they've been, the local bishops, they've been involved with this sort of process all the way through. So it's not true that only the thing was taken away from them. It's part of the church process. So people who say that don't understand what's been going on, basically. But I know it has been very widespread, that sort of story.
What about the good fruits of Medjugorje? Maybe we can end with this, and we'll set up part 2, which will be a Q&A, because there's so many people are interested in this topic. Okay. I myself, just speaking for me, I praise God that people have come to faith, that they return to the church, that they go to the sacraments. I know at least of one priest who credits his vocation to his experience there in confession, and there are undeniable, salient, legitimate good fruits for which we should be grateful. What say you?
I agree. As you say, you can't deny that there have been conversions and good fruits in that sense. I mean, you obviously got to balance that against all the bad fruits, but there have been good fruits. Now, I would say that those good fruits, essentially, we're talking about confessions and the use of the sacraments and people coming back to the church. Well, that is totally independent of what the visionaries have said or done. That's really, as I was saying, you've got this sort of culture in a sort of, I say primitive in inverted commas, culture in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it's really the sort of culture that say that was in Ireland, 60 or 70 years ago. It's just a very Catholic culture. So when people from the West who have lapsed or whatever go there, and they see the lines of people going to confession, the enthusiasm, and the masses and the whole everything that's on offer there. That is a sort of pushes people towards confession, and that's the biggest factor, I think, the confession. I mean, you could go to confession at the North Pole, and it's still the sacrament of confession.
It makes me wonder: is Santa a Catholic? And would he be available to? No. That's true, yeah. So the validity of the sacraments, that's the power. That is the power of all conversions, especially the Eucharist, of course, the source and summit of our faith. Donald, let's press pause, and I want to revisit this in a second edition with your patience and your willingness to spend time with us. On the second half of this Medjugorje coverage on the Patrick Coffin Show, we're going to cover 3 things. Number 1, are the seers lying? Presuming now that the church is correct, that there's nothing supernatural at play here, are they lying? Is it human fraud, or is it demonic in nature? Secondly, what is the finding, or what is known at all about the Rowini Commission led by Cardinal Camillo Rowini of Rome, which currently has submitted their findings summarizing decades of this phenomena, now currently on the desk of the Holy Father, Pope Francis. By the way, a quick note, we are not getting ahead of the church. We are not short-circuiting or setting ourselves up as any kind of authority. We're simply reviewing the historical facts of the matter in a way that uncovers things you probably haven't heard before. Whatever the church says, I myself, and I'm sure most of you listening, will certainly abide. What supporters of Medjugorje have to realize is that no Catholic is bound by private revelation, even approved ones, but all Catholics must abide by a condemnation. And thirdly, your questions, which were solicited through Facebook. We got some great questions. We're going to go through some of the more positive-oriented and some of the negative-oriented. And just for the record, I did not censor any positive comments about Medjugorje. I didn't touch or edit them in any way. So up next, in the second edition of this two-part series on Medjugorje with author Donal Foley, author of Medjugorje Revisited. You can find out show notes, also on the Vatican documents and the pronouncements of the local bishops at patrickcoffin.media. Thanks, Donal. We'll see you real soon.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Okay, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?